The crystal champagne flute slipped from Victoria Sterling's manicured fingers, shattering against the Italian marble floor of her penthouse office as I signed the divorce papers without even reading them. The sound echoed through the silence like a gunshot, and for the first time in 3 years of marriage, I had her complete attention. Blake Morrison straightened from where he'd been lounging against the mahogany doorframe, his smug expression faltering as he watched me fold the $8 million check and slip it casually into my jacket pocket. This wasn't how either of them had scripted this scene. Victoria's perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the shock creeping across her features. Her lips, painted in that signature red that had graced countless magazine covers, parted slightly as she stared at the signed documents. The late afternoon sun streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows caught the diamond wedding ring she'd already removed, sitting cold and abandoned on her glass desk like a discarded prop. I'd expected this moment for months. The hushed phone calls, the sudden business trips, the way Blake's eyes followed Victoria with predatory hunger during board meetings. What I hadn't expected was how easy it would be to walk away from the golden prison I'd helped build around both of us. Standing slowly from the leather chair that had cost more than most people's cars, I smoothed down my simple khaki pants and button-down shirt. The contrast between my modest appearance and the opulent office wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Victoria had always dressed me like an accessory, but today I'd chosen my own clothes that would serve me well where I was going. Blake cleared his throat, the sound sharp and nervous in the thick silence. He'd been Victoria's assistant for 8 months, climbing the corporate ladder with the kind of ambition that left ethical considerations scattered in his wake. At 26, he possessed the sort of boyish charm that wealthy women found irresistible, especially when paired with just enough vulnerability to trigger their protective instincts. The irony wasn't lost on me. Victoria had built her fortune by acquiring struggling companies, gutting them for parts, and selling off the pieces. Now she was being acquired herself, though she was too blinded by infatuation to see the hostile takeover happening right under her perfectly sculpted nose. My phone buzzed against my chest, a reminder of the reservation I'd made for the evening train back to Meadowbrook. 3 years in Manhattan had been long enough to learn the rules of Victoria's world, long enough to play them better than she ever realized, and definitely long enough to secure my own future while she focused on quarterly profits and market dominance. Victoria found her voice finally, though it came out smaller than the commanding tone she used in boardrooms. The woman who could reduce Fortune 500 CEOs to stammering boys suddenly sounded uncertain, almost fragile. Blake moved closer to her, his hand finding the small of her back in a gesture of possession that made my skin crawl. The gesture was calculated, designed to remind me of everything I was losing. What he didn't understand was that I'd never really had it to begin with. I picked up my worn leather messenger bag from beside the chair, the same bag I'd carried through 4 years of state college and into this marble and glass tower. It contained everything that truly belonged to me, which wasn't much by Victoria's standards, but was more than enough for mine. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime as I pressed the call button. Victoria's heels clicked frantically against the marble as she took a step toward me, some delayed instinct finally kicking in. But I was already stepping inside, turning to face them one last time. The doors closed on Blake's confused expression and Victoria's dawning realization that her perfectly orchestrated dismissal had just become something else entirely. My name is Ethan Carter, and I've spent the last 3 years perfecting the art of being underestimated. To most people who knew us, I was the lucky small-town guy who'd somehow managed to marry Manhattan's most successful venture capitalist. The narrative was simple and comfortable. Victoria Sterling had rescued me from obscurity, transformed me from a community college graduate working at a hardware store into the husband of a woman whose net worth exceeded the GDP of several small countries. The truth, as it often is, was considerably more complex. I'd met Victoria 4 years earlier during what she would later describe to her society friends as her darkest period. Her tech empire, Sterling Dynamics, was hemorrhaging money after a series of disastrous acquisitions. The financial press was circling like vultures, and her board of directors was quietly discussing her removal. She'd come to Meadowbrook not for romance or rural charm, but because she'd heard about a small manufacturing plant that might be worth acquiring for its patents. That plant happened to be owned by my late father's business partner, and I happened to be helping manage the sale negotiations. While Victoria saw a desperate small-town operation ready to be absorbed, I saw something else entirely. I saw a woman who'd built an empire through intuition and aggression but had never learned the value of patience or strategic restraint. Our first meeting took place in Murphy's Diner, a conversation that would change both our lives in ways neither of us could have predicted. Victoria, dressed in a suit that cost more than my monthly salary, sat across from me in a cracked vinyl booth while I outlined why her acquisition strategy was fundamentally flawed. She'd been buying companies for their immediate assets while ignoring their long-term potential, treating each purchase like a hostile takeover rather than a strategic investment. What followed was 3 hours of the most intense business discussion of my life. I showed her how to restructure her existing holdings, how to identify undervalued companies with genuine growth potential, and how to build sustainable revenue streams instead of relying on quick asset flips. By the time the diner closed, Victoria Sterling was looking at me like I'd just solved a puzzle she'd been struggling with for years. The relationship that developed wasn't built on romantic love, though we both played those roles when necessary. Victoria needed someone who understood business strategy without threatening her position as the public face of Sterling Dynamics. I needed access to capital and connections that could transform my own carefully laid financial plans into reality. Our marriage was a merger disguised as a romance. Victoria got a husband who could provide strategic guidance without challenging her authority, someone who would blend into the background at social events while offering crucial insights in private. I got a front-row seat to high-level financial operations, access to investment opportunities most people could never dream of, and the chance to build my own portfolio using strategies Victoria never bothered to monitor. During our 3 years together, I'd helped Victoria turn Sterling Dynamics from a failing conglomerate into a billion-dollar empire. Every major decision bore traces of my influence, from the acquisition of cloud tech solutions to the strategic partnership with Morrison Industries. The financial press credited Victoria's newfound business acumen, never suspecting that her greatest asset was the quiet man who attended her galas in off-the-rack suits and small-town humility. But while Victoria focused on public recognition and quarterly growth, I was playing a longer game. Every successful deal generated commission opportunities I'd quietly negotiated into our prenuptial agreement. Every new connection opened doors to private investment opportunities. Every month, I moved money through a network of accounts Victoria never knew existed, building a financial foundation that had nothing to do with her empire, and everything to do with my own future security. The prenuptial agreement Victoria's lawyers had crafted was designed to protect her assets while offering me a modest settlement in case of divorce. What they hadn't anticipated was how thoroughly I'd understand their language, or how carefully I'd negotiate seemingly minor clauses that would prove extraordinarily valuable. The spousal support calculations, the business consultation fees, the investment sharing agreements. Victoria had barely glanced at while signing would ensure my financial independence regardless of how our marriage ended. My childhood in Meadowbrook had taught me the value of patience and careful planning. My parents, both teachers, had lived modest lives but had saved and invested with remarkable discipline. They'd left me a small inheritance and, more importantly, a set of principles about building sustainable wealth that contrasted sharply with Victoria's boom and bust mentality. Throughout our marriage, I'd maintained connections to my hometown and the people who'd shaped my early years. Every month, I'd send money back to help maintain the community center, support local scholarship programs, and keep the small network of businesses viable. Victoria saw these contributions as charitable tax deductions, never realizing they were investments in the community I planned to return to eventually. There was one connection from my past that I'd deliberately avoided discussing with Victoria, someone whose memory had influenced every strategic decision I'd made since leaving Meadowbrook. Sarah Mitchell had been my closest friend through high school and into college, a brilliant student whose family couldn't afford to support her academic ambitions. I'd used my early inheritance to help fund her education, watching from a distance as she'd earned her PhD in biochemical engineering and built a reputation as one of the country's leading researchers. Sarah and I had lost touch after I'd moved to Manhattan, a separation that had been deliberate on my part. The feelings between us had grown too complicated, too genuine for me to navigate while building the kind of strategic relationship I needed with Victoria. But Sarah's success, built partially on foundations I'd helped provide, remained a source of quiet pride and a reminder of what authentic partnership could look like. Now, as the elevator descended from Victoria's penthouse office toward the street level, I found myself thinking about Sarah for the first time in months. The $8 million check in my pocket, combined with the investments I'd carefully cultivated over 3 years, would be more than enough to return to Meadowbrook and build the kind of life my parents had envisioned for me. Victoria Sterling had gotten exactly what she'd wanted from our marriage. Her company was thriving, her public image was secure, and she was free to pursue whatever relationship she chose with Blake Morrison. What she didn't realize was that I'd gotten exactly what I'd wanted too. The art of being underestimated, I'd learned, was perhaps the most valuable skill anyone could master in a world where perception shaped reality and patience determined who ultimately won the game. The first photograph arrived on my phone 3 days after I'd signed the divorce papers, while I was sitting in the back of a taxi heading to Grand Central Station. Blake Morrison's face filled the screen, his arm draped possessively around Victoria's shoulders as they posed in front of some exclusive restaurant I'd never bothered to visit during our marriage. His expression was triumphant, like a hunter displaying his prize kill. The message that accompanied the photo was even more revealing than the image itself. "Thanks for stepping aside gracefully," Blake had written. "Victoria deserves someone who can match her energy and ambition. Enjoy your retirement in whatever small town you crawled out of." I studied the photograph with the same analytical detachment I'd once applied to market research reports. Victoria looked radiant in a way I'd rarely seen during our marriage, her smile genuine rather than performative. Blake's grip on her waist was territorial, marking his claim for anyone who might be watching. They looked like a couple who belonged together, two predators who'd found their perfect hunting partner. What Blake didn't know, what Victoria had never bothered to discover, was that I'd spent the last 18 months building a comprehensive understanding of Sterling Dynamics' internal operations. My access to Victoria's systems hadn't been limited to the strategic consulting she'd explicitly requested. Every email server, every financial database, every personnel file had been an open book to someone patient enough to ask the right questions and humble enough to be ignored by the people who mattered. Blake Morrison's employment file made for fascinating reading. He'd joined Sterling Dynamics 8 months earlier, after leaving his previous position at Meridian Corp under circumstances that weren't entirely clear from the official records. A deeper investigation, 1, I'd conducted through contacts Victoria didn't know I possessed, revealed a pattern of strategic positioning that was both impressive and deeply unethical. At Meridian, Blake had systematically documented confidential client information, strategic plans, and financial projections before submitting his resignation. Within weeks of joining Sterling Dynamics, several of Meridian's major clients had switched their business to Victoria's company, bringing with them detailed knowledge of their former partner's weaknesses and vulnerabilities. Victoria had attributed this windfall to Blake's exceptional networking skills and her own company's superior services. She'd rewarded him with rapid promotions, increased access to sensitive information, and eventually, the kind of personal attention that had evolved into their current relationship. What she hadn't noticed, what Blake had been careful to hide behind his charming smile and eager-to-please demeanor, was that he was systematically documenting Sterling Dynamics operations with the same methodical precision he'd applied at Meridian. Through my network of information brokers and financial analysts, I'd traced Blake's activities over the past 3 months. Confidential client lists were being copied to encrypted drives. Strategic planning documents were being photographed during supposedly romantic late-night office sessions. Financial projections and merger plans were being transmitted to offshore accounts connected to several of Sterling Dynamics' primary competitors. Blake Morrison wasn't just Victoria's new boyfriend, he was running the most sophisticated corporate espionage operation I'd ever encountered, and he was doing it right under the nose of one of Manhattan's supposedly sharpest business minds. The ethical dilemma was surprisingly complex. Victoria had treated our marriage as a business arrangement, using my strategic insights while keeping me emotionally at arm's length. She'd replaced me with Blake without a moment's hesitation, clearly believing that younger and more attractive automatically meant better and more valuable. Part of me felt obligated to warn her. 3 years of working together had created a professional respect that transcended our personal relationship's limitations. Victoria might have been cold and calculating, but she'd also been honest about her priorities and consistent in her behavior. She didn't deserve to be destroyed by someone whose criminal activities would inevitably be traced back to her company. But another part of me, the part that had spent 3 years being patronized and underestimated, felt a certain poetic justice in letting Blake's plan unfold naturally. Victoria had built her empire by acquiring struggling companies and extracting value from them. Now she was being acquired herself, though she was too blinded by infatuation to recognize the hostile takeover happening in her own bedroom. My packed belongings sat in neat boxes in the apartment Victoria had never considered home, just another piece of real estate in her portfolio. Everything that truly mattered to me fit into 2 suitcases and the worn leather messenger bag that had accompanied me through college and into my marriage. The financial statements I'd printed that morning made for interesting reading. The $8 million divorce settlement was substantial, but it represented only a fraction of the wealth I'd accumulated during our marriage. Strategic investments, consultation fees, and carefully negotiated profit-sharing agreements had built a portfolio that would generate passive income for the rest of my life. Victoria's accountants, focused on protecting her assets from a potentially greedy ex-husband, had never bothered to track the money flowing in the opposite direction. They'd never investigated the investment firm I'd established, the real estate holdings I'd accumulated, or the network of business relationships I'd cultivated. In their minds, I was the small-town husband who'd been fortunate enough to marry above his station, not a strategic player capable of building independent wealth. My phone buzzed again, another message from Blake. This one contained a photograph of Victoria's empty office, taken from behind her executive desk. The implication was clear. Blake now occupied the position of trust and influence that had once been mine. He had access to everything that mattered in Victoria's world, and he wanted me to know it. What Blake didn't realize was that I'd never wanted Victoria's world permanently. The Manhattan penthouse, the exclusive social events, the constant pressure to maintain appearances had always felt like an elaborate costume I was wearing temporarily. My real life, the life I'd always planned to return to eventually, was waiting for me in Meadowbrook. The train to Meadowbrook would depart in 2 hours. My childhood home, maintained but empty since my parents' deaths, was ready for my return. The financial independence I'd carefully built would allow me to live quietly, perhaps teaching at the local college or helping small businesses develop strategic plans. As I watched Blake's messages arrive with increasing frequency, each one more taunting than the last, I found myself thinking about justice and consequences. Victoria Sterling was about to learn a very expensive lesson about trusting people who told her what she wanted to hear instead of what she needed to know. The question was whether I had any obligation to prevent that education from occurring, or whether some lessons were valuable enough to justify their cost. My finger hovered over Victoria's contact information in my phone. One call could save her empire and destroy Blake's carefully laid plans. One moment of compassion could prevent the financial devastation I could see approaching like a storm on the horizon. Instead, I deleted Blake's messages, silenced my phone, and focused on the future I'd spent 3 years building in secret. Some investments required patience to reach their full potential, and some people needed to discover the true cost of their choices without interference from those who'd tried to warn them. The art of strategic thinking, I'd learned, sometimes meant knowing when not to act. The train pulled away from Grand Central Station as the Manhattan skyline faded into evening shadows, each mile of distance feeling like a layer of costume being peeled away from my skin. For 3 years, I'd been Ethan Carter, the grateful husband, the small-town boy made good, the fortunate man who'd won the lottery by marrying Victoria Sterling. Now, finally, I could return to being simply Ethan Carter, whoever that person actually was beneath all the strategic positioning and careful performance. The first-class seat Victoria had unknowingly paid for through our joint account offered a view of the Hudson River, its dark waters reflecting the last traces of daylight. I'd chosen this particular train deliberately, timing my departure to arrive in Meadowbrook after sunset when the town would be quiet and I could slip back into my childhood home without drawing attention from neighbors who remembered the boy who'd left for college and somehow ended up married to a billionaire. My reflection in the window showed a man who looked younger than his 32 years, though the lines around my eyes had deepened during my marriage to Victoria. The stress of maintaining a facade while building a secret financial empire had taken its toll, even when that stress was largely self-imposed. I'd spent 3 years anticipating this moment, planning for it, building toward it, yet now that it was actually happening, I felt strangely hollow. The emotional complexity of my situation was something I deliberately avoided examining too closely during the marriage. Victoria had made it clear from the beginning that our relationship was built on mutual benefit rather than romantic love. She needed strategic guidance and social respectability. I needed financial access and business connections. The arrangement had been honest in its dishonesty, transparent in its manipulation. But Alone in that train car, watching familiar landscapes emerge from the darkness, I found myself wondering whether I'd ever truly cared for Victoria beyond our professional partnership. There had been moments, usually late at night when she'd been working on particularly challenging deals, when I'd glimpsed something vulnerable beneath her polished exterior. Times when she'd sought my advice not as a consultant, but as a partner, when her mask had slipped enough to reveal genuine uncertainty or fear. Those moments had been rare and quickly buried beneath her natural competitiveness, but they'd existed, they'd been real, and I'd used them, just as systematically as I'd used everything else about our relationship, to build trust that served my own long-term interests. The guilt was unexpected and unwelcome. I'd entered the marriage with clear intentions and honest motivations, at least honest by Victoria's standards of emotional transparency. She'd wanted a strategic partner who wouldn't threaten her position or demand romantic attention she couldn't provide. I'd wanted financial opportunities and business experience that would set up my eventual return to the life I'd always planned to live. Neither of us had been deceived about the fundamental nature of our arrangement. Neither of us had promised love or faithfulness or emotional intimacy beyond what was necessary for public appearances. Yet somehow, knowing that Victoria was probably in Blake Morrison's arms at that very moment, celebrating their victory over the naive small-town husband, created a knot of resentment in my chest that had nothing to do with strategic thinking. My phone had been buzzing intermittently since leaving the city, messages and calls from business associates who'd heard about the divorce and wanted to offer congratulations or condolences depending on their relationship with Victoria. I'd turned off the notifications, needing the silence to process what felt like the end of one life and the uncertain beginning of another. The portfolio statements in my briefcase told a story of remarkable financial success, numbers that would have seemed impossible when I'd first left Meadowbrook as a college graduate with modest savings and big dreams. Every investment had been calculated, every opportunity maximized, every relationship leveraged for its strategic value. I'd played Victoria's game better than she'd ever realized, building wealth that would outlast whatever happened to Sterling Dynamics or her relationship with Blake. Yet success felt strangely anticlimactic when measured against the isolation it had required. For 3 years, I'd been surrounded by Victoria's world of wealthy friends, influential business partners, and social climbers, but I'd never formed genuine connections with any of them. They'd seen me as Victoria's husband, an accessory to her success, rather than an individual worthy of independent consideration. The loneliness had been manageable when I'd been focused on building toward this escape, but now that the escape was actually happening, I wondered what kind of life I was returning to. Meadowbrook represented safety and authenticity, but it also represented a past I'd deliberately left behind when I'd recognized that my ambitions exceeded what a small town could offer. My childhood home would be exactly as I'd left it, maintained by a local property management company, but empty of the warmth and life my parents had provided. The friends I'd grown up with had mostly moved away, or settled into lives that no longer intersected with mine. The girl I'd cared about most, Sarah Mitchell, had built a successful career in research science, probably never thinking about the boy who'd helped fund her education before disappearing into marriage with a woman whose name appeared regularly in business magazines. Sarah represented the path not taken, the relationship I'd abandon. In favor of strategic advantage. We'd been close through high school and into college, close enough that I'd used my inheritance to help pay for her graduate studies without expecting anything in return. Close enough that I'd seen myself falling in love with her during those final weeks before I'd left for Manhattan and deliberately cut all contact. The decision to end our relationship had been rational and necessary. Sarah was building a career that required focus and dedication, and I was pursuing opportunities that demanded the kind of emotional detachment she would never have understood or accepted. Maintaining our connection would have complicated both our lives and potentially undermined both our ambitions. But rationality didn't eliminate the persistent wondering about what might have been different if I'd chosen love over strategy, authenticity over advantage. Sarah's success in her field had been documented in academic journals and research publications I'd followed discreetly over the years. She'd built exactly the kind of life I'd hoped she would build, apparently without needing the support or companionship I'd convinced myself would only hold her back. The train began slowing as it approached Meadowbrook's small station, the familiar landmarks of my childhood emerging from the darkness like memories made physical. The hardware store where I'd worked through college, the diner where I'd first explained strategic business planning to Victoria Sterling, the residential streets where neighbors still left their doors unlocked and everyone knew everyone else's history. Coming home felt like both a retreat and a victory, though I wasn't entirely certain which characterization was more accurate. I'd achieved everything I'd set out to accomplish when I'd married Victoria, building financial independence and gaining business experience that would serve me for the rest of my life. I'd escaped the marriage before it could trap me permanently in a world I'd never wanted to inhabit forever. Yet I was returning alone, with wealth but without companionship, with security but without purpose beyond the vague idea of living quietly and helping my community in whatever ways presented themselves. As the train pulled into Meadowbrook station, I found myself thinking about Blake Morrison and the systematic destruction he was bringing to Victoria's empire. Part of me felt obligated to warn her, but a larger part recognized that some lessons couldn't be taught, only experienced. Victoria had chosen Blake over me, youth over experience, charm over substance. The consequences of that choice would unfold according to their own logic, regardless of any intervention I might attempt. My role in Victoria's life was finished, completed as thoroughly as any successful business transaction. Now I needed to discover what role I wanted to play in my own life, and whether the strategic thinking that had served me so well in marriage would prove equally valuable in whatever came next. The knock on my door came at 7 in the morning, 3 weeks after I'd settled back into my childhood home in Meadowbrook. I'd been expecting the local pastor or perhaps one of my parents' former colleagues, people who'd heard about my return and wanted to offer condolences or catch up on the years I'd spent away. What I wasn't expecting was Sarah Mitchell, standing on my front porch in an expensive rental car with her arms crossed and fire in her eyes. She looked nothing like the struggling college student I'd helped years earlier, and everything like the successful scientist she'd become. Her dark hair was shorter now, styled with professional precision, and she wore a tailored business suit that probably cost more than most people in Meadowbrook made in a month. But her eyes, those intelligent green eyes that had always been able to see through whatever facade I was constructing, hadn't changed at all. The anger radiating from her was immediate and overwhelming, transforming the peaceful morning into something that felt like the calm before a tornado. She didn't wait for me to invite her inside, pushing past me into the living room I'd been carefully restoring to match my parents' memory of home. Sarah turned to face me, her professional composure cracking to reveal years of accumulated resentment and hurt. The woman who'd earned her PhD in biochemical engineering, who'd published groundbreaking research, who'd built a reputation as one of the country's leading experts in her field, looked at me like I was a problem she'd finally decided to solve. "Ethan Carter," she said, her voice carrying the kind of controlled fury that was somehow more intimidating than shouting. "The great strategic mastermind, the man who invests in people's futures and then disappears when they try to thank him." I'd prepared for many possible complications in my return to Meadowbrook, B's. Sarah Mitchell confronting me about our past had never made the list. She'd built her own life, achieved her own success, moved far beyond whatever help I'd provided during her college years. The last thing I'd expected was for her to track me down and demand explanations for decisions I'd made nearly a decade earlier. "You look surprised," Sarah continued, settling into my father's old armchair with the kind of territorial confidence that suggested she planned to stay as long as necessary to get the answers she wanted. "Did you think you could just slip back into town quietly and nobody would notice? Did you think your famous ex-wife's divorce wouldn't make the news, even in a place like Meadowbrook?" The realization hit me like cold water. Of course the divorce had been reported in business publications, and of course Sarah, working in academic circles that overlapped with corporate research, would have seen those reports. My carefully planned quiet return had been anything but quiet to someone who'd been paying attention to my life from a distance. "I've been following your career," she said, confirming my suspicions. Victoria Sterling's husband, the strategic consultant who helped build a billion-dollar empire. "Very impressive, Ethan, very different from the boy who used to help me with calculus homework and talk about maybe teaching high school mathematics someday." Her tone carried layers of meaning I wasn't sure I was ready to unpack. There was hurt there, and disappointment, but also something that might have been pride mixed with betrayal. Sarah had built her own success, but she'd never forgotten the person who'd helped make that success possible, and she'd never forgiven him for disappearing without explanation. "You want to know what I found most interesting about those business articles?" Sarah continued, leaning forward in the chair. They all talked about Victoria Sterling's brilliant strategic mind, her ability to identify undervalued companies and transform them into profitable enterprises. But I remembered a conversation we had in college where you explained those exact same concepts to me when I was struggling with a business economics requirement. My stomach tightened as I realized where this conversation was heading. Sarah hadn't just been following my career casually, she'd been analyzing it, applying the same systematic intelligence that had made her successful in research to understanding what I'd been doing during our years apart. So I started investigating, she said, her voice taking on the clinical tone she probably used when presenting research findings. I traced Victoria Sterling's turnaround to right around the time you married her. I found interviews where she credited her husband's insights for helping her develop new strategic approaches. I connected the dots, Ethan, because that's what I do for a living. The accusation hung in the air between us, unspoken but clearly implied. Sarah believed I'd used her, just as I'd used Victoria, building relationships that served my strategic purposes rather than forming genuine emotional connections. But here's what really made me angry, Sarah continued, standing up and beginning to pace around the living room like a prosecutor making her closing argument. It wasn't that you helped Victoria Sterling build her empire using ideas you'd developed years earlier. It wasn't even that you married her for strategic advantage rather than love. It was that you did the same thing to me. I opened my mouth to protest, but Sarah cut me off with a gesture that brooked no interruption. You identified me as a good investment when we were teenagers, she said, smart girl from a poor family, lots of potential but no resources to develop it, so you invested in my education, helped me get through college and graduate school, and then disappeared the moment I started to succeed. You didn't want my gratitude or my affection because those would have complicated your plans to move on to bigger and better opportunities. The pain in her voice was unmistakable now, years of wondering and hurt finally finding expression. Sarah had built a narrative about our relationship that cast me as a calculating manipulator who'd used her as practice for the larger game I'd eventually play with Victoria. That wasn't how it happened, I said, finally finding my voice. Sarah, you don't understand the situation I was facing when I left for Manhattan. The opportunities I had were time-sensitive, and maintaining our relationship would have been unfair to both of us. Unfair to both of us, Sarah repeated, her tone mocking. How convenient that you got to decide what was fair without consulting me. How strategic of you to eliminate complications before they could interfere with your long-term planning. She moved closer, her eyes bright with the intensity that had always made her formidable in any argument. The successful scientist who'd conquered her field was still the girl who'd never backed down from a challenge, who'd always demanded honesty even when the truth was uncomfortable. Well, here's some news for you, Ethan, she said. I quit my job last month, gave up a 7-figure salary and a research budget most scientists would kill for. You want to know why? The question caught me off guard, partly because it seemed unrelated to our argument, and partly because the answer genuinely confused me. Sarah had built exactly the kind of career I'd hoped she would build. Walking away from that success made no sense according to any strategic framework I could construct. Because I realized I was living the life you'd planned for me instead of the life I actually wanted, she said. I was so focused on proving that your investment had been worthwhile that I never stopped to consider whether the path I was following actually made me happy. She sat back down, this time choosing the couch where she could face me directly. Her anger hadn't disappeared, but it had been joined by something that looked like determination. So here I am, she continued. Back in Meadowbrook, at least temporarily, to settle some unfinished business with the person who shaped my life more than he had any right to do. The implications of her presence were staggering. Sarah Mitchell, one of the country's leading biochemical engineers, had given up her career to track me down and demand explanations for decisions I'd made when we were both different people with different priorities. Meanwhile, my phone had been buzzing with increasingly urgent messages from financial contacts in Manhattan. Victoria's empire was beginning to show the first signs of stress as Blake Morrison's activities started affecting client relationships and strategic partnerships. The systematic theft of confidential information was creating cracks in Sterling Dynamics' foundation that would soon become visible to competitors and investors. Sarah noticed my distraction and glanced at my phone. More strategic opportunities to manage, she asked, her tone sardonic. Or are you monitoring the consequences of your last strategic withdrawal? The question was more perceptive than I'd expected. Sarah had always been able to read me better than anyone else, a skill that had apparently only sharpened during our years apart. "I'm not managing anything," I said. "My relationship with Victoria ended when I signed those divorce papers. Whatever happens to her company now is her responsibility." Sarah studied my face with the same intensity she'd probably applied to molecular structures in her research. The analytical mind that had made her successful in science was now focused on understanding motivations and consequences that I wasn't entirely comfortable having examined so closely. "So you're just going to watch her empire collapse," she said, "even though you could probably save it with a single phone call." The observation was accurate enough to be uncomfortable. I did have the information that could expose Blake Morrison's activities and potentially save Sterling Dynamics from the systematic destruction he was orchestrating. But intervention would mean re-entering Victoria's world, just when I'd finally escaped it. "Some lessons can't be taught," I said finally. "They have to be experienced." Sarah nodded slowly, as if my response had confirmed something she'd already suspected about my character. "Well then," she said, settling back into the couch with an expression that suggested she'd just made an important decision. "I guess we'll both get to experience some lessons we never expected." The confrontation I'd been unconsciously preparing for arrived on a rainy Thursday morning 6 weeks after Sarah had established herself as a permanent fixture in my life. I was reviewing quarterly reports from my investment portfolio when the sound of expensive tires on gravel announced a visitor who didn't belong in Meadowbrook's quiet residential streets. Through the kitchen window, I watched Victoria Sterling emerge from a black sedan that probably cost more than my childhood home. She moved with the careful precision of someone who was barely holding herself together, her usually impeccable appearance showing signs of strain that would have been invisible to casual observers but were glaringly obvious to someone who'd spent 3 years studying her moods and reactions. Her designer coat hung loosely on a frame that had lost weight she couldn't afford to lose. Her trademark confidence had been replaced by something that looked almost like desperation, though Victoria would have died before admitting to vulnerability of any kind. She stood in my driveway for several moments, gathering courage for a conversation she'd probably never imagined having to initiate. Sarah appeared in the doorway between the kitchen and living room, coffee mug in hand and an expression of fascinating curiosity on her face. She'd been living in my spare bedroom for 6 weeks, officially to help me renovate the house but actually to wage a campaign of persistent presence that was slowly wearing down my carefully constructed emotional defenses. "Is that her?" Sarah asked, her tone carrying the clinical interest of a scientist observing an unexpected specimen. The famous Victoria Sterling, come to visit her strategic ex-husband in his humble hometown retreat. Before I could answer, Victoria knocked on the front door with the kind of authoritative rhythm that had once commanded boardrooms but now sounded almost plaintive. Sarah moved to answer it before I could object, opening the door with a smile that managed to be both welcoming and territorial. "You must be Victoria," Sarah said, extending her hand with professional courtesy. "I'm Sarah Mitchell, Ethan's friend. He's mentioned you, of course." The lie was smoothly delivered and completely convincing. I hadn't mentioned Victoria to Sarah beyond answering direct questions about my marriage, and Sarah knew it. But the implication that I'd been discussing my ex-wife with another woman created exactly the dynamic Sarah intended to establish. Victoria stepped inside, her sharp gaze taking in the modest furnishings of my childhood home before settling on Sarah with the kind of assessment she'd once applied to potential business acquisitions. The contrast between the two women was striking and deliberate, Victoria in her expensive desperation, Sarah in casual clothes that somehow made her look more confident and grounded than her perfectly dressed counterpart. "I need to speak with Ethan privately," Victoria said, her voice carrying traces of the authority she'd once wielded effortlessly but now seemed to require conscious effort to maintain. Sarah glanced at me, raising an eyebrow in a silent question. I nodded, and she disappeared into the kitchen, close enough to overhear but far enough away to maintain the fiction of privacy that Victoria needed to say whatever had brought her to Meadowbrook. Victoria sat on the edge of my father's old armchair, perching like a bird ready to take flight at the first sign of danger. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles white with tension that she couldn't quite hide beneath her practiced composure. "Blake is destroying everything," she said without preamble, her voice carrying a mix of fury and disbelief that made her sound younger and more vulnerable than I'd ever heard her. Every client relationship, every strategic partnership, every competitive advantage we've built over the last 3 years is being systematically dismantled. I waited for her to continue, offering neither comfort nor condemnation. Victoria needed to tell me this story, needed to work through the implications of what she'd discovered about her young lover's true motivations, but she also needed to do it without feeling like she was begging for help from the husband she'd discarded. He's been selling our client lists to competitors, she continued, her professional mask slipping to reveal raw anger underneath. Trade secrets, strategic plans, financial projections, everything. The FBI raided our offices yesterday morning. They have evidence of systematic corporate espionage dating back to his first week of employment. The timeline matched what I'd suspected but hadn't been able to prove. Blake Morrison had targeted Sterling Dynamics deliberately, researching Victoria's vulnerabilities and positioning himself as the perfect solution to needs she hadn't known she had. They're calling it one of the largest corporate theft cases in recent history, Victoria said, her voice becoming smaller with each word. The company is finished, Ethan. Clients are fleeing, investors are pulling out, and the legal bills are going to consume whatever assets we have left. I found myself feeling genuine sympathy for Victoria despite everything that had happened between us. She'd built her empire through aggressive tactics and ruthless competition, but she'd always operated within legal boundaries. Being destroyed by someone who'd used criminal methods to gain her trust represented a kind of betrayal that cut deeper than simple romantic disappointment. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Victoria's composure finally cracked completely, tears she'd probably been holding back for days spilling down her cheeks. "Because you knew," she said, her voice breaking. "You knew what he was doing, and you didn't wow on me." The accusation hung between us like a physical barrier. Victoria had connected the dots, recognizing that my access to information and my strategic thinking would have made Blake's activities visible to me long before they became obvious to her. "You could have saved everything with a single phone call," she continued, wiping her eyes with hands that shook slightly, "but you chose to let me learn the hard way what happens when you trust the wrong person." From the kitchen came the soft sounds of Sarah preparing lunch, a domestic normalcy that contrasted sharply with the dramatic collapse Victoria was describing. The woman who'd once commanded billion-dollar deals was sitting in my childhood living room, financially ruined and emotionally devastated, while another woman who'd given up her own successful career was making sandwiches and pretending not to listen to our conversation. "You're right," I said finally. "I could have warned you about Blake, I chose not to." Victoria stared at me as if I'd slapped her, shock replacing the desperate hope that had brought her to my door. She'd expected me to deny knowledge of Blake's activities, to claim ignorance of the systematic destruction that had been unfolding while I'd been renovating my childhood home and learning to live with Sarah's persistent presence. "Why?" she asked, the single word carrying years of accumulated questions about motivations and loyalties and the true nature of relationships built on strategic advantage rather than emotional connection. "Because you needed to learn the difference between strategic thinking and genuine partnership," I said. "Because you'd spent 3 years treating me like a valuable consultant while never bothering to discover who I actually was beneath the role I was playing." Sarah appeared in the doorway, no longer pretending to give us privacy. She leaned against the frame with her arms crossed, studying Victoria with the same analytical intensity she'd once applied to complex research problems. "He did the same thing to me," Sarah said, her voice carrying a mix of understanding and accusation. "Helped me build a successful career and then disappeared when maintaining the relationship became inconvenient for his long-term planning." Victoria turned to look at Sarah, confusion replacing desperation as she tried to understand the dynamics of whatever relationship Sarah and I had developed since my return to Meadowbrook. "The difference is," Sarah continued, moving into the room and settling onto the couch with casual authority, "I came back to settle the score. I gave up my career, tracked him down, and decided to take responsibility for ensuring he doesn't run away from emotional complications again." The implication was clear and startling. Sarah hadn't just returned to Meadowbrook to confront me about our past. She'd returned to claim me, to force the kind of genuine relationship I'd spent years avoiding in favor of strategic advantage. Victoria looked between us, her sharp mind working through the implications of what she was observing. The successful scientist who'd given up everything to pursue a man who'd helped shape her career. The ex-husband who'd built a fortune by strategically partnering with wealthy women and then withdrawing when emotional complications arose. You collect successful women, Victoria said, her voice taking on the analytical tone she'd once used to dissect struggling companies. You identify potential, provide strategic support, and then benefit from their success while avoiding genuine emotional investment. The assessment was accurate enough to be uncomfortable, particularly coming from someone who'd experienced my methods firsthand. Victoria had spent 3 years married to me without understanding the systematic approach I'd applied to building wealth through strategic relationships. Sarah stood up and moved to sit on the arm of my chair, her hand resting possessively on my shoulder. The gesture was casual but unmistakably territorial, marking her claim for Victoria's benefit. The difference this time, Sarah said, her tone carrying the confidence of someone who'd made an irrevocable decision, is that I'm not letting him disappear when things get complicated. I've invested too much in understanding how his mind works to let him slip away again. Victoria stared at us, recognition dawning in her eyes as she realized what she was witnessing. Sarah hadn't just tracked me down for explanations about our past relationship, she'd tracked me down to force a future relationship, using the same strategic thinking I'd applied to my marriages and partnerships. You're both insane, Victoria said, but her tone carried something that might have been admiration mixed with disbelief. She'd built her empire through aggressive acquisition tactics, but she'd never encountered anyone who'd applied those same tactics to personal relationships with such systematic precision. Sarah smiled, the expression carrying satisfaction and determination in equal measure. Maybe, she said, but insanity sometimes produces better results than conventional approaches. Victoria stood up, her professional composure returning as she processed what she'd learned about both my methods and my current situation. The woman who'd once commanded boardrooms was adapting to circumstances beyond her control, already beginning to plan whatever came next. I suppose I should thank you, she said, looking directly at me. If you'd warned me about Blake, I would have fired him and never learned how thoroughly I'd been played. At least this way, I know exactly how naive I was. She moved toward the door, pausing to look back at Sarah and me. We probably looked like an unlikely couple, the strategic thinker who'd spent years avoiding emotional complications and the brilliant scientist who'd given up everything to force those complications into existence. For what it's worth, Victoria said, her tone carrying grudging respect, you two deserve each other, you're both calculating enough to appreciate what you're getting into. After Victoria left, Sarah and I sat in silence for several minutes, processing the confrontation that had just unfolded. The woman who'd once been my wife was facing financial ruin and criminal investigations. The woman who'd claimed responsibility for my future was sitting beside me, having given up her own successful career to wage a campaign for my attention. The strategic thinking that had guided my decisions for years suddenly seemed inadequate for navigating the emotional complexities Sarah had introduced into my carefully planned life. She'd outmaneuvered me using my own methods, building a case for why we belonged together that was both logically compelling and emotionally irresistible. So, Sarah said finally, her hand still resting on my shoulder. Are you ready to stop running from complications and start building something that actually matters? Looking at her, I realized that all my strategic planning had led me to exactly this moment, sitting in my childhood home with a woman who understood my methods well enough to turn them against me, finally ready to discover what genuine partnership might look like when both people were equally committed to making it work. The answer, I discovered, was surprisingly simple to give. 5 years later, I woke up to the sound of Tommy Carter Mitchell arguing with his mother about the proper way to feed chickens in our backyard. At 7 years old, our son had inherited Sarah's scientific precision and my strategic thinking, a combination that made him formidable in any negotiation involving chores, bedtime, or ice cream consumption. Sarah, you're overcomplicating the chicken feeding process, I called from the kitchen window where I was preparing coffee with beans grown by a cooperative I'd helped establish in Guatemala. The chickens don't need their feed distributed according to a mathematical formula. Tommy agrees with me, Sarah called back, her voice carrying the same confident authority she'd once used to present research findings to academic conferences. We've calculated the optimal nutritional distribution based on each hen's laying productivity and metabolic requirements. Our son nodded seriously, his small hands gripping a measuring cup with scientific precision. Daddy, Mom says, chickens are basically biological machines that convert feed into eggs, and biological machines work better with proper calibration. I laughed despite myself, recognizing Sarah's influence in Tommy's vocabulary and reasoning patterns. She'd left her high-paying research career to domesticate me, but she'd never abandoned the analytical mindset that had made her successful in the first place. The transformation of our relationship from confrontation to partnership had surprised everyone, including us. What had started as Sarah's strategic campaign to prevent me from disappearing again had evolved into the kind of genuine collaboration I'd spent years avoiding. She understood my need for intellectual challenges and financial security, while I appreciated her refusal to let strategic thinking substitute for emotional honesty. Our life in Meadowbrook represented a compromise that satisfied both our ambitions and our need for authenticity. Sarah consulted remotely for biotech companies that needed her expertise, earning consulting fees that rivaled her former salary while maintaining control over her schedule and priorities. I managed a portfolio of investments that had grown substantially since my divorce from Victoria, focusing on sustainable businesses that aligned with our values rather than simply maximizing returns. The house had been completely renovated, combining Sarah's scientific approach to efficiency with my appreciation for comfortable simplicity. Solar panels powered our electricity needs, a sophisticated water filtration system ensured drinking water quality, and the garden produced enough vegetables to supply several neighbors while serving as Tommy's outdoor laboratory for understanding plant biology. My phone buzzed with a message from Victoria, something that happened perhaps once a month as we maintained the kind of professional relationship that acknowledged our shared history without romanticizing it. After Blake's arrest and the collapse of Sterling Dynamics, she'd spent 2 years rebuilding her reputation and financial foundation. Her new company, Sterling Consulting, was smaller but more ethically grounded than her previous empire. Blake Morrison had been sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for corporate espionage and financial fraud. The systematic theft he'd orchestrated had affected dozens of companies beyond Sterling Dynamics, making him a cautionary tale about the dangers of trusting charm over character in business relationships. Victoria's message contained a link to a business article about sustainable investing, accompanied by her typical brief commentary. "Thought you might find this interesting. Your influence on my strategic thinking continues to generate positive returns." She'd never directly acknowledged that my refusal to warn her about Blake had ultimately helped her become a better businesswoman, but her occasional messages suggested she understood the lesson embedded in that painful experience. Sometimes the most valuable education came through consequences rather than instruction. Sarah appeared in the kitchen doorway, dirt on her jeans and satisfaction in her expression. Tommy's scientific approach to chicken care had apparently yielded successful results. She poured herself coffee and settled beside me at the table where I was reviewing investment reports on my laptop. "Anything interesting in the portfolio?" she asked, her tone carrying the casual interest of someone who understood financial strategy but trusted me to manage the details. "The renewable energy fund is performing better than projected," I said, turning the screen so she could see the quarterly returns. "And the educational technology investments are starting to show substantial growth now that remote learning has become mainstream." Sarah nodded, sipping her coffee while studying the numbers with the same analytical attention she'd once applied to molecular structures. Our financial success had allowed us to support causes we cared about while building security for Tommy's future, but it had never become the primary focus of our relationship, the way it had been during my marriage to Victoria. Tommy burst through the back door, his face bright with excitement and his hands still dusty from chicken feed. "Mom, Dad, the brown hen laid 2 eggs this morning." That's statistically unusual based on her previous laying patterns. Sarah grinned at our son's terminology, ruffling his hair with obvious pride. "Maybe she's responding to improved nutrition management," she suggested, "or perhaps she's simply having a productive week." "Or maybe," I added, settling Tommy on my lap, while he examined the eggs he'd collected, "chickens are more complicated than biological machines, and sometimes they surprise us regardless of how well we think we understand their patterns." Tommy considered this philosophical observation with the seriousness of a child who'd been raised by 2 people who treated his questions as worthy of genuine discussion. "That would make chickens more like people than like machines," he concluded. "People do unexpected things, even when you think you know how they work." Sarah caught my eye over Tommy's head, her expression carrying amusement and something deeper. Our son's observation reflected insights about human behavior that had taken us years to fully appreciate. The strategic thinking that had guided my early relationships had been based on treating people like predictable systems that would respond to specific inputs in reliable ways. The reality, as Tommy was discovering through chicken observation and as I'd learned through Sarah's persistent campaign to claim my attention, was that the most interesting relationships developed when people chose to be unpredictable in service of something more valuable than individual advantage. My laptop chimed with an email from the investment firm I'd established to manage other people's portfolios. The business had grown steadily as wealthy clients discovered that my approach to financial strategy produced consistent returns without the ethical compromises that characterized many high-yield investment operations. Sarah read over my shoulder as I reviewed client reports, her hand resting casually on my back in the kind of unconscious physical connection that had developed gradually during our years together. The woman who'd given up her research career to force me into emotional honesty had somehow created the kind of partnership I'd never believed was possible. Tommy slipped down from my lap and returned to the backyard, probably to conduct further observations of our small flock of chickens. Through the window, we could see him crouched beside the coop with a notebook, documenting whatever patterns he'd identified in their behavior. "He's going to be formidable when he grows up," Sarah observed, watching our son with obvious pride. "The combination of your strategic thinking and my analytical skills is producing some interesting results." "As long as he learns to value people for reasons beyond their strategic utility," I said, recognizing the lesson I'd spent years learning myself. Sarah turned to face me, her expression carrying the kind of serious attention that meant she was about to say something important. "Do you ever regret walking away from Victoria's world?" she asked. "The money, the influence, the recognition that came with being married to someone that successful." The question was one she'd asked in various forms over the years, usually when she was processing her own decision to abandon her research career for domestic life in a small town. I'd learned to answer honestly rather than strategically, recognizing that Sarah needed truth more than reassurance. "I regret not understanding the difference between strategic partnerships and genuine relationships earlier," I said. "I regret treating people like investments instead of recognizing their intrinsic value. But I don't regret ending up here with you and Tommy, building something that matters beyond financial returns." Sarah smiled, the expression carrying satisfaction and affection in equal measure. She'd gotten exactly what she'd wanted when she'd tracked me down 5 years earlier, forcing me to confront the emotional complications I'd spent years avoiding. "Good answer," she said, leaning in to kiss me with the casual intimacy of someone who'd claimed permanent possession of my attention and had no intention of relinquishing it. Outside, Tommy was explaining something to the chickens in his serious 7-year-old voice, probably sharing his theories about optimal laying conditions or nutritional requirements. He'd inherited our analytical minds but was developing them in service of genuine curiosity rather than strategic advantage. The best investment I'd ever made, I realized, hadn't been financial at all. It had been allowing Sarah to catch me, to force me to stop running from emotional complexity, and to discover what authentic partnership looked like when both people were equally committed to each other's happiness. The art of strategic thinking, I'd finally learned, was knowing when to stop thinking strategically and start living authentically. Some returns were worth more than money, and some partnerships produced dividends that couldn't be measured in quarterly reports. Tommy's laughter drifted through the open window as one of the chickens apparently did something unexpected, reminding us all that the most valuable outcomes often emerged from the willingness to be surprised by life's beautiful unpredictability.